Hi, my name is Gile, and I'm an author, a journalist, an editor, and a publisher. And I'm here right now to share with you some excerpts from programs I do helping children develop their reading and writing powers. And also, I'll share some from programs I do with parents and teachers and some things I share at education conferences because I think they can be very useful when children have some free time at home, because free time at home is really a great opportunity to develop what I call the important foundational skills. And those are reading, writing, listening, thinking, and speaking. And to a great extent, those are the skills that will determine the degree of success that the students will have both in school and well after school days are over. One of the things that I recall is when our two oldest children were at the University of Illinois. I was a member of the Dads Association there, and there were business leaders who came back and were saying, you know, you're doing a wonderful job of creating engineers and accountants, but some of these students have a little difficulty with writing, and that's a very great difficulty for them because if they are unable to write well, it means a sign that they're unable to think clearly. And if they're not able to think clearly, they're going to be severely restricted on what they're going to be able to accomplish, both in professionally and in other ways after school days. And so this is a great opportunity for parents and teachers and the students themselves to advance their performances in these very great foundational skills. So one of the first things I want to do is to thank you for taking the time to listen to some of these things that I'm going to share with you, some tips and tools, some reading heroes, and also just I want to encourage you to realize how important it is what you are doing. I have to tell you something that happened to me. I have, again, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of work in schools across the country and in Europe and abroad, New Zealand. And I want to share with you what I sometimes share with students. One day I came out of a school and I pulled out my keys to open the door of my car. But when I pulled out my keys, this is what I found. The end of my key had broken off. And I stood there, I don't know how it happened, but I stood there and I looked at it and I had several thoughts, but finally one of them was, wow, this is what it's like when you don't have reading power. Because reading is the key that opens the door and lets us go where we want to go and do what we want to do. So I saved that key after that happened, and I share it with others because it is a symbol of the importance of reading. And then another experience I had was when I was doing programs in Germany. I was driving on the Autobahn. Now, the Autobahn has no speed limits in large sections of the Autobahn. So I wasn't doing anything wrong, but when I was traveling on the Autobahn, I was going about 105 miles an hour. Now again, I wasn't doing anything wrong because there is no speed limit on large sections of the Autobahn until you come to certain areas where they restrict the speed. But as I was driving along, I was encountering signs that I wasn't sure what the signs meant. Now I had a German-English dictionary on the seat of the car, but when you're driving 105 miles an hour, it's not a good idea to be consulting a dictionary to see what a sign you're passing says. Not only that, but when you're going 105 miles an hour, well, by the time you find out what it said, you're well down the road. And as that was happening to me, I thought, wow, that's what it's like for persons who don't have reading power. And then I was back in the United States, and I had to do programs in another city. And the night before I left for the program to do the programs, there was a snowfall. Now it was a wet, sticky snow, And so it was sticking to all of the signs along the interstate. Now, I have a GPS, but in that particular case, it wasn't with me. And so I was driving because I knew where I was going. It was a simple thing. And as I was driving along, though, and I noticed that all the signs on the interstate were covered with snow, and of course I couldn't read them. And then I thought, wow, this is imagine what this is like for persons who are coming who can't read. This is what it's like. It's the words would mean nothing. And so I knew what exit I was going to take, and I knew where I was going to be going. But again, that was a reminder for me of what it is like when you don't have reading power. And as a matter of fact, that's really what prompted me to do some of the writing I do. In my programs, I've now worked with students in 39 states. I did 3 trips to Europe, 1 to New Zealand. But as I was doing that, I was discovering that children are not developing their reading power. They're spending a lot of time watching TV or playing computer games, but because they're doing that, they're not developing their reading power. And so that's what prompted me to write a book called "Oh How I Wished I Could Read." It was a story that I made up to encourage children to develop their reading power. It's a book that parents and teachers use to help the children discover in a very practical way how important reading is. Teachers often call this a book using environmental reading. In other words, it encourages the children to read signs and to read, to practice reading when they're not in school, when they're free. And so that's a very, very, and to me that's a very, very important part of helping children develop their reading power, helping them discover how important it is to develop that reading power and how much fun it is too. Another problem, of course, as I traveled, I realized that children who are not developing their reading power also are not developing their vocabulary power. Because when you are watching television and playing computer games, you're watching someone else's creativity, but you're not doing much for your own. And you're living in a world, the world of the spoken word is always a world with a smaller vocabulary than the world of reading. And so I felt the need to create a tool, again, that parents and teachers could use to encourage children to realize how important it is to read so that they can develop their vocabularies. And so that's why I wrote another book, which I can't find. Here it is, a book called "What Is That Thing? Whose Stuff Is This?" Because so often I hear children using that expression, "Bring me that thing," or "What is that stuff?" And again, when we know the proper word, we have power. That's why I also refer to writing as writing power and word power. And sometimes I encounter children in programs who will say, "Oh, writing is so difficult." What I find out is that they actually are able to write, but the problem is because they spend so much time watching television or playing computer games, they're not developing that word power, which is so critical to develop your writing power. Words are symbols for ideas, of course, and the more words we know, the more ideas we know, and the more ideas we know, the more creative we can be, because creativity is just a process of putting old ideas together in a new way. And so word power is very, very critical. I sometimes talk with children. Just recently I had an occasion to talk with some children, and I asked, if you want to build a brick building, what do you need? Well, of course, the answer is you need bricks. If you don't have many bricks, you can't build a very good brick building. Well, when we are writing, you might say that the words that we use are like the bricks that are used in building a brick building. And so it's very important to develop that vocabulary power, because that's what gives us the power to write well. It gives us the power to have many ideas. And of course, it also helps because when you're watching television and playing computer games, you're in more of a passive mode. When you are reading, you are engaging in a very high level intellectual undertaking. And you are developing your ability to work, to to your what I call the effort-making faculty, and it's very, very important to have that ability when you are writing, because writing is, I'm sorry, it's a discipline, and writing requires effort. And so if you're engaging in a lot of passive activities, when it comes time for you to have that developed to write, you'll need that effort-making faculty. And if you haven't developed it, then you're going to have some great difficulties. And unfortunately, if you don't develop your writing power, once again, it's going to limit your capacity to excel in whatever it is that you want to do. So reading and writing, foundational skills. And now again, and so how do parents? I mentioned that how parents can help at home, because parents do play a major role. And so the teachers have always told me that they can tell children who are read to at home. And of course now, after working with more than 500,000 students, probably closer to 1 million, we stopped counting. I, of course, can do that too. I can tell children who are read to at home. And so there are many signs. One of them, of course, is that children who are read to at home have a greater attention span. When you're reading to and with your children, you are helping them develop their listening skills and their capacity to focus. One of the challenges that we have in our culture is that we have more and more people who are incapable of concentrating for a sustained period on a complex subject and coming to a logical or rational conclusion. So reading at home will empower your children to have a greater attention span and to be able to focus for a prolonged period. So many people in our culture are experiencing what I call Sesame Street syndrome, and that is they are only able to focus for a short period. And some of our children come into school expecting our teachers to perform like Sesame Street, little 3-minute vignettes. And so it's very, very important to help the children develop that capacity to focus. We don't want them to have Sesame Street syndrome, where they can only think for a short period and then their attention. It's almost like learned ADD behavior. Now, I mentioned another advantage. When you read to and with your children at home, you help them develop a greater vocabulary. There was a study completed some time ago comparing the writing of children in the last century, in the middle of the last century, with the writing of the children at the beginning of this century. And what they found is that the children who were writing when they in mid-century they had about vocabularies. They were able to extrapolate vocabulary figures, and the children then had about 25,000 words in their vocabularies. And then when they studied the children around the turn of this century, and they found out that the children had only had a vocabulary power of about 10,000 words. So the children knew fewer than half of the words that their parents and grandparents knew. Now that's a very serious matter, of course, because once again, words are symbols for ideas. The more words you know, the more ideas you know, therefore the more creative you can be. And so it's very, very important to help our children by reading to and with them at home. The opportunity, especially during the time when they're not in school, is very great for enriching the children and strengthening them in the most important and most vital skills. Now another reward for reading to and with our children at home is that the children tend to do better academically. Of course, again, part of that is because of the things that we just talked about, and so they tend to perform better throughout their entire academic career. Another aspect of another advantage to reading to and with our children at home is that they become more creative. And of course, that's easily understandable because of what we just said about how they develop their vocabulary power and their ability to think creatively. Another advantage is that they become, of course, they learn to love books, and then they become themselves more proficient readers, because we are learning machines. and we want to learn. And when children are given that opportunity to learn, and they experience the joy of learning, they internalize, they become motivated themselves. And a motivated learner is halfway home. And so again, they learn to love books. They become proficient readers. They become more creative. They do better academically, and of course, the children become more self-confident too. That's another advantage of reading to and with our children, because reading to and with our children is a way of saying two things. It says that reading is important because when busy parents take time out of their day to read with the children get it. This is important, what's happening here. But it's also a very powerful way for us to tell our children, I love you. And so, again, reading to and with the children at home is very, 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 very important. Now, I have, there's, now a motivated child will develop his or her power to teach. The children that develop the power to teach themselves because they're hungry for knowledge. And so there's one of my reading heroes is a fellow by the name of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a slave. Great book, by the way. This is his biography, and he was a slave. It was given to a family in Baltimore, and when he arrived, the mother was teaching her son how to read. And Frederick Douglass saw that, and he said, I would like to learn how to read. Well, she was a kind woman, and she started to teach Frederick Douglass how to read. But then her husband found out, and he said, what are you doing? It is against the law to teach a slave to read. Well, Frederick Douglass overheard that, and then that's when he realized that reading is the key to the advantages that the slave owners had over the slaves. And when I'm working with children, I often ask them, why do you think the slave owners had made it against the law to teach a slave to read? And I get wonderful answers from the children. They tell me, well, it's because if you can read, then you don't have to depend on the slave owner. You can go off and do, and have a living without depending on that person. You can read signs to escape to freedom. You can learn that no one has the right to make a slave of someone else. And so it's a very, I love the answers that I get from the children when I ask that question. And I sometimes ask them, if you, let's just say that when you come to school in the morning, you find people outside of school with clubs ready to beat you up if you try to get inside and learn how to read and write. I ask them, how many of you would come back to school if you knew that there were people out there with clubs trying to keep you out of school? And it's amazing. There are a lot of heroes in those classrooms because all the hands go up. And so those children are also among my reading heroes. As I said, I have quite a few that I share with students and parents and teachers in various programs. So it's good news when I see the children respond like that, because again, it's a great power to be able to read. And sometimes one of my books is a story I made up for when our two oldest children were having a little difficulty getting along with each other, and I wanted to find a way to encourage them to be kind to each other, and also to understand that when they hurt each other, they hurt me too. And so the story that I created is called The First Forest, and in the story, the heroes are the evergreens. Well, I share it with children at programs often, and then I talk a little bit about the reading, how important it is, and I like to create symbols for the children, and to give them words that will help them remember how important whatever it is that we're talking about is to them. And so I point out that, first of all, the word author itself comes to us from a Latin word augere, from the Latin word octor, which comes to us from a Latin word augere, which means to grow. And also, if you read the story in the first forest, the heroes are the evergreens, and green is a word that comes to us from a Teutonic word gra, which means to grow. And so again, reading and writing are all about growing. It's all about growing, and so that's part of what this reading with the children at home and helping them to read is doing. It's helping them to grow, and so and when we teach our children to read, I always think of it as being kind of like teaching our children to ride a bicycle. We don't do it for ourselves. We do it because we know the great joy that the children are going to have in their lives when they have the ability to ride that bicycle. And we teach them reading for the same reason, because we know the great joy that they're going to have in their lives when they develop their reading power, which is the gateway to writing power, which opens up the great thinking power and listening power and speaking power. And so these foundational skills that you are helping develop when school's not in session are very important, and they will be important for all of their lives. So that's again another reason why reading is so vitally important. And again, of course, readers also learn faster and they learn better. When we speak, we can speak at about 125 words a minute, approximately 125 words a minute. But when you read, you can take in information and you develop your reading power. You can take into, some readers are more than 500 words per minute, some much more than that. And so what that means is that if you're learning the same subject, you're learning by reading 4 times faster than you would if you were watching a video or listening to a speech. So that means that if 2 persons on January 1st are given the same material that they must learn, what happens is the person who is reading at a faster rate will finish the material by the 1st of February. But the person who is relying on video, for example, won't finish that block of material until May 1st. And so that's why reading is a way of, we learn more, we learn faster. And there's even a study that suggests that when we are reading, we understand better and we retain longer. So the advantages that you are giving your children by helping them develop their reading power in school or out of school is going to pay lifelong dividends. I was doing programs in Alabama, and a radio station asked me to come out after my programs and talk about literacy. And so it was a 90-minute program, and I was supposed to be on for 30 minutes. But when we started talking about literacy, we received so many phone calls that I was actually on for the entire program. And it was interesting because at the end of the program, the host and I both realized that we had answered so many questions about so many different topics that literacy, the ability to read, write, listen, think, and speak, there has a connection to every social problem America has. So we go a great deal in the direction of solving many of our problems if we simply give our children strong reading power, which is related to writing power, etc. And one of the callers, by the way, I thought it was very interesting, called in and said, okay, you want to know why we should read? Take the word read, why read is the question. Take the why and put it at the end of the word read. And what do you get? You get the word ready. When you can read, you are ready for anything and everything. There's a story, a friend of mine told me about a friend of his who was building a house, literally building a house on his own. And he asked his friend, who taught you? Who taught you how to do all the carpentry and plumbing and electrical work and everything that's involved? And who taught you that? And his friend said, nobody, but I can read. And of course, again, so that is another example. When you can read, you are ready for anything. Now, I have, and I'll talk more about the writing in another video, but let's talk about what you can do at home, especially when when the children have some free time. One of the things that there's another man who I spend a lot of time, I have spent a lot of time through the years speaking at education conferences, and there's another person who's been doing that too. His name is Jim Trelease, and he's the author of For Reading Out Loud and the new Read Aloud Handbook and other books. And Jim, I thought it was interesting, said one day that he can't believe that he gets paid for speaking and encouraging parents to read to their children. He said to him, it was kind of like telling the parents that now when you put your baby down, put the pillow under the baby's head, not on top. It's common sense, Jim was saying, to read to and with our children. Now, again, another thing, by the way, that happens is when we read to and with our children, is it gives us an opportunity to discern any problems that might exist. There was a study, I believe it came out of Iowa, which indicated that about 25% of the children coming into school come in with some kind of a reading disability. So which can be corrected. So when we are reading with and to our children, we can spot those kinds of circumstances and we can take immediate action to correct whatever problem it might be. So what do parents do? One of the most important things you can do is, of course, be a reader. Be a reader yourself. Model for the children. Children imitate what they see us doing. If they see us spending a lot of time watching TV, our children will think watching TV is important. And they will become TV watchers themselves. If they see us reading, they will understand that reading is important. And so they will become readers themselves. That's modeling is one of the most important things that we can do. Have publications in the house, newspapers, magazines, books. Print out interesting items from the internet. Read them yourself. Let the children see you reading, and they will begin to understand how important reading is. So another thing, connect rewards to reading, or have contests. Like any new words that they can bring to the dinner table at night because of something they found while they were reading. Have a reward of some kind. Could be a financial reward. When my children were young, I remember giving a reward if they could come to the table with any word which I didn't know the definition. And that was a fun thing too. If I could find one, I would give them a reward. One day, one of our daughters came to the table, and she had found in the dictionary "de gustibus non est disputandum," a Latin expression which means tastes are not subject to dispute. And so I felt bad because I knew it, so I gave her a reward anyway. But you can make up your own contests related to reading and rewarding the children for reading. Also, you can make reading a part of your relationships. For example, at dinner, when you're making dinner, have your child read to you and then discuss what is being read while you're making dinner or at dinner. And you can bring interesting articles from newspapers and magazines and from the print out books and print out articles from the internet and bring those to the table for reading and for discussing. Show your interest and be excited about reading. That's another. It conveys a very important message to the children. Of course, we can give magazine subscriptions and books as gifts. That's always an effective way of doing that. And then have reading time at home where everybody stops whatever they're doing and everybody spends some time reading. I was doing programs in Massachusetts, and I had a very interesting experience because I was in a school district that was struggling with funding, and they had actually laid off reading teachers and librarians. It was a very, very difficult situation. but they responded creatively because what they did is they took a segment of the school day and they set it aside so that everybody in the school, the principal, the counselors, the janitors, everybody sat down and read. There was a time when the whole school was silent and everybody was reading, and they could bring books from home. That would be something that they could read during this special reading time. And by the way, that paid off very well for them because just the process of reading, once again, it provides tremendous academic rewards. So and then of course it's important to keep the joy in reading. And help the children discover the pleasure of reading just because they because they're finding things that are interesting, and you can help them find topics that they're interested in and read about and they can and help them read about those things. So keeping the joy in reading is important. And then of course when access to libraries and bookstores is available, make it an outing. Add lunch. It could be a reward. Get a book at the bookstore because of achieving some reading goal. Again, it's also very important to limit TV time and computer game time and smartphone time because the National Assessment of Education Progress tells us that the less TV and digital entertainment that children have, the higher their reading scores and, of course, therefore, the higher their academic performance. Now, one of the problems with watching TV is that it diminishes the amount of time that the children can have interaction with adults. And of course, language interaction with adults is our primary preparation for learning. So turning off the TV and having conversations is again, a very powerful way to help our children. And one of the things I love at schools, sometimes they will use TV for book reports. They will ask, what did you watch? And what was the author's message, helping the children understand that what you watch on TV, an author has created that. And so what is the author's message? And then what would it be like if everyone in the world behaved the way the people in the TV program you were watching behaved? Is that the kind of world that you want? Is that the kind of you that you want to be? And so what that does, of course, is it encourages critical thinking. TV goes to the emotions, reading goes to the brain. And so, again, it's if you can introduce an element of thinking, even while they happen to be watching television, that would be advantageous also. So, talking about what they're watching, talking about the behavior of the people, encouraging to write about that encourages critical thinking, which is another wonderful development that goes hand in hand with developing reading power and of course, which leads to writing power and thinking, listening, and speaking. And another thing is, if you're going to have the TV on, be sure to take advantage of closed captioning. Let those words run across so that the children are actually reading while they're watching television. And I know a psychologist who says for the benefit of the children, don't have a TV in the child's bedroom. Either in effect either throw the television out the window or you're throwing the child out the window, because watching television means that the people you're watching on television become role models that actually become even more important in the children's lives, than the parents and other persons who are striving to have a positive influence. Now, for younger children, one of the things that I like to do is suggest that if it were in my power, I would give every school it could be a digital recording device, it could be a phone, I suppose, or whatever, into which the child reads. Well, of course, you can do this at home. Have the child pick a book, and then have the child read the book, and read it into the recorder. Then have the child read the same book over again for a few days, and then have the child record again the reading into the recorder, and then do it again for a few days. And what you find is that the child has the opportunity to see how he or she is improving And so when the children can see how they're improving, it's it helps to motivate them to read and to advantage to experience the joy of growing. Children are, again, natural learners, and when they hear how much better they're getting, they say, I can do this. In my programs, I have other programs. I'll probably do a video based on journal writing too. And one of the students, a fourth grader, came up to me after a program one day and said, you know, I've been keeping a journal since I was in second grade, and boy, am I getting good. And I thought, wow, that's perfect, because the child is taking responsibility for his writing, and he was experiencing that joy that we're talking about, the joy of learning, the joy of knowing I can do this, the joy of growing. Remember those words. Author is a word that comes from the Latin, which means to grow. And if you read The First Forest, the heroes in the story are the evergreens. Gra, the green comes to us from the word gra, which means to grow. So it's all about growing. Now, there's something else that's important. There are sometimes when I go into schools, I see the children have made artwork, like the covers from books that they're reading, and they're posted all around near the ceiling of the walls in the classrooms. And I discovered that could be something that we should think about a little bit more, because encouraging children to read many books is a good thing, but it can also inadvertently be teaching children that reading is boring, because not every author touches the heart of the reader. And so I want to encourage children to realize that it's okay to read the same book over and over again. As a matter of fact, that's a way of developing language power. And then another thing is that when we reward the children for the number of books they read, we may inadvertently be discouraging slow readers. They may feel saddened because they don't read as many books as other children do. And yet a slow reader actually may be benefiting more than a child who reads a lot of books. And that's important to remember. And also, it's important to remember that it isn't important. It isn't how many books you get through. It's how many books get through to you. So again, the program called Read a Million Minutes, I think, hits the bullseye, because in that program the children are rewarded for the time spent reading. So a fast reader or a slow reader can win the same awards because they are being rewarded for the amount of time that they spend in this important thing called reading. Now, I have there's something that we need to remember. The National Assessment of Education Progress gives us a lot of clues of how we can help our children. And it's important not to be discouraged. There are some reports that indicate that only about 35% of our children nationally are reading at what's called the proficient level. Now, one of the things that I've told parents, as a matter of fact, I wrote it in my my author's note in What Is That Thing? Whose Stuff Is This? And that is that children with parents actively involved in their children's education scored 28 points above average in reading, while children with low parental involvement scored 46 points below average in national reading, cited by the U.S. Secretary of Education. That 74-point spread is about 1/3 of the average score of reading for children. And so those results remind us that helping children develop reading power and all the powers that flow out of reading is a team effort. Helping our children read is a team sport. Parents have about 1/3 of the responsibility. Teachers have about 1/3 of the responsibility. And the children themselves have about 1/3 of the responsibility. So each of us has a vital role to play, a contribution to make in helping our children develop this incredible power of reading. So let's not be discouraged by some of the statistics that come out. The National Assessment of Education Progress gives us huge clues about how we can help our children. But they cited some of the difficulties, and perhaps in the process of citing those difficulties, also confirmed that what parents do at home is critical, because the schools can't do it all. For example, in-school reading time declines after grade 5. By high school, it's reduced to kindergarten time. The top 5% performing students read 144 times more than the bottom 5%. Private school practice reading is 67% greater than public school students. Higher performing National Assessment of Education Progress students engaged in 59% more reading practice than those in the bottom 25%. And so it really is just common sense, of course. It's just like sports. The athlete who spends a lot of time training is probably going to be a champion. The child who spends a lot of time reading is probably going to develop that power much more effectively than those who don't. And of course, with reading comes writing power, and listening and speaking and thinking. So another important role for parents is to keep in touch with the school and talk about assignments. Read the children's papers, share the experience that they are having, because students with home conversations about schoolwork do much better. They perform much higher, and of course they read better. So the bottom line is, I guess we have to be leaders who lead by example, by being readers. Children don't do what we say, they do what we do. We also, sometimes parents will tell me, well, they can't find a way, that they can't motivate the children to read. The trick there is to listen to the children, to spend a lot of time focusing on finding out what their interests are. When I was a boy, either my parents or one of my sisters gave me a book for Christmas. I lived for football, basketball, and baseball. I loved sports. And the book that I received was one of the books from what's called the Chip Hilton series. Now, Chip Hilton is the series is written. It's written by a man named Claire B., and he was a coach in Long Island, a very successful basketball coach. But he wrote this series of books about this fictitious character, Chip Hilton. And Chip Hilton, the book that I received was the fall of his freshman year in high school. And of course he was playing football. Well, I read that book, but the next book, now basketball season comes, and so now he's playing basketball. Well, I've got to read that book too. And then basketball season ends, and baseball comes. And so I've got to read that book. Well, that's the way that's the way it went. Each year, freshman, sophomore, and junior and senior year in high school, Chip was playing those 3 sports. And so that was 12 books I had to read while he was in high school. And then he went on to college, and the same thing happened. So there were another 12 books that I had to read from his freshman year through his senior year. And actually, it went beyond that. So I was locked into reading, but I was reading about something that I loved. And I have to tell you, every once in a while now, I've come across those books in antique stores. And I have, of course, quite a few of them myself, because having books that you love, there's a tactile dimension to reading. And having books that you love, it's a very warm feeling. It's almost like having a really treasured guest in your home. And you can have a conversation with that guest anytime you want. And so the thing I've learned is I looked back at those books and I found, wow, they were well written. And so it must be something that got into my system that led to my being a writer. And another thing I liked about the books was that in the Chip Hilton series, there was always a villain who came into the high school or the college team. But the interesting thing about the Chip Hilton series is that the villain was converted. was turned from a bad person into a good person. It was good from someone who was hurting the team to someone who was helping the team. And I just loved that aspect of, unlike so many of today's stories where if somebody is in that situation, so often the authors just kill them. And that's not what Chip Hilton's books were all about. And so I'm very grateful that I had those books. And by the way, later I wrote a book called Warriors Forever, which is about an extraordinary back-to-back championship team in West High School in Rockford, Illinois, led by an incredible coach, Alex Sadargas, who overcame all kinds of problems, and his wife Alice, who was a wonderful educator. She was a member. She was a teacher, and then a member of then a principal, and then a member of the school board. And she both Alex and Alice had this gift for bringing out the best. And that was when I wrote this book. I wanted to capture that aspect of the story, and I hope I did. I've had some wonderful feedback. But I think that might be related to the Chip Hilton stories that I read as a boy. So, by the way, speaking of boys, 75% of the children who are in remedial reading programs are boys. And so it's very important, I think, for us to think about that. You know, fathers and grandfathers, we spend a lot of time teaching our young boys to hold a wrench and throw a football. But it really is very important for us also to be teaching them to read, by reading to and with them, and by being readers ourselves, by modeling reading. So those are some of the things that we can do at home. But I also want to tell you, speaking of the importance of reading and its relation to writing, I was doing programs at a school, and the teachers told me about a beautiful little fifth grader who couldn't be at school the day that I was doing the programs at her school. And they told me how much she loved reading and writing. And so I call her little. She was a little fifth grader. I call her little because she had been sick all of her life, and she had not grown as much as many children do. And again, she was unable to be in school when I was at her school. So I went to visit her at home after I completed my work at the school. And we talked about many things, many things. And she shared with me a book of poetry that she had written. And I have to tell you that what she had written was as good as or better than some high school and college students' writing that I've seen. And so I asked her. I knew she hadn't been in school as much as most students are, but I also knew that she read a great deal. So I asked her, when you were reading, do you pay attention to how writers use words and phrases, punctuation? And she said, oh, yes. Well, what she taught me that afternoon is that we develop reading power simply by spending a lot of time reading. It's one of the primary ways that we learn to write. The more time we spend reading, the better we write. The more time we spend writing, the better we read. And so they grow together. And so she taught me that afternoon. I also want to just conclude with a word of encouragement, because sometimes I find teachers or parents who are discouraged because they're having trouble reaching one of the children at home or one of the students at school. And I always encourage them to realize that it's very important not to let someone take away your joy that you have as a nourishing, caring person. If you have watched this video to this point, you are one of those nourishing, encouraging persons that I'm addressing. And sometimes we have difficulty reaching a particular child for a particular period, and so it's what I try to encourage the teacher or the parent to realize is that you are like the sun shining, and your rays are reaching two objects. One is an ice cube, a hard, solid object, and the other one is mud, soft and flowing. It's the same sun shining on the two objects, but the outcome is different. Is in the case of the ice, the hard solid object becomes soft and fluid, turning to water, of course. And the soft fluid mud turns hard, becomes like a brick. It's the same sun. The difference is in the objects. And so it's very important never to let someone take away the joy that you have as a nourishing, caring person. The reason it's important not to let someone take away that joy is because that would diminish your power to have your wonderful influence on others. And so, again, you are entitled to and you have a right to be happy about that nurturing and caring characteristic that is central to your being. And so when I finish up my programs, I always tell my children, there are three, I ask them to hold up three fingers. Before I do that, I'm going to let you know that you can find out more about my programs, and you will see more writing tips at the website, https://johngile.us. So you can go there and to get more information if you would like. And if you have questions that you would like to have me answer or address in these videos, this is the mailbox which you can reach me. It's just mailbox@johngile.us. And when you send me your questions or comments, I welcome comments too, of course, that would be wonderful, because that will trigger another video. I have quite a stack of letters, and what I'm doing now is just starting to make video responses, and that will be hopefully will be helpful for parents, for teachers, and for students. And there's one other thing I like to, when you have younger children at home, when we're talking about reading, it's never too early to start. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to visit this afternoon, this evening, or whatever time of day it is where you are. And I look forward to seeing you next time. The three things that I always ask the children to do when I finish a program is hold up three fingers, because there's something, there are three things I want you to remember above all. And I'm going to give you a word for each finger, and you are going to be tested on this. And the three things that I want you to remember are read, read, read. Because that is the key to success. The key to success and in everything that you're going to do. So I look forward to hearing from you. And again, thank you. And anything that I can do to help in any way, please send me a note, and I will do my best to respond promptly.